Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, have you ever tasted chocolate?
Yes, I have. Have you?
No, I never have. Would you describe the taste to me?
I suppose it is sweet but also bitter. A little bit creamy but also crumbly. It's very difficult to describe.
I can see that, and even harder still to describe sensations like sweet, bitter, creamy, and crumbly for one who has never experienced those.
I suppose the only way to fully understand is to experience. To know the taste of chocolate, one must taste chocolate.
I do not doubt that enlightenment is the same way. It is ineffable. Words fail to describe and make sense of it for someone who has not tasted it. That presents a problem. If it cannot be described, how do we convince people to strive for it?
I suppose we must use our words wisely and say that it is very tasty and that people ought to try it because it is very good. Then maybe people will take the leap of faith and actually try a piece of chocolate.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the Buddhist philosophy of language. What is the Buddhist philosophy of speech, language, and words? What are some of the doctrines surrounding speech, language, and words? And how do those doctrines play out in ritual and practice? We hope you enjoy.
So, what is the Buddhist philosophy of speech, language, and words?
There are a great many perspectives on this issue, but I will try and describe the highlights of some of the common characteristics of them. Before we get into this, however, we should come to an understanding of what the word language actually means. It may seem simple, but you might find that's a little bit more complicated to work with. In the West, we regard it to mean an internally coherent system of words, grammar, speech, communication, signification, and some means of achieving mutual understanding. In this understanding, no word is more powerful or sacred than another, for the most part. Meaning stems from context and from relationships between words, and so all words are on a level playing field. For the purposes of this discussion, we should use this framework, although there are many, many notable exceptions to it and many problems with it. I think that this is what most people think of when we say the word language, and so I think it's a useful starting point. For the most part, Buddhism seems to disagree with this system. Words in Buddhism are karmically and morally charged, and therefore they're not all on an equal playing field. However, there's some more nuance to this that we will discuss in this episode. Before we get further into it, I also think it's important to discuss what's at stake in this question. If language is somehow insufficient or unusable for Buddhism, that presents a huge problem. If the written word or speech and oration are not useful ways of attaining enlightenment or leading others to it, then how are we to understand and make use of the massive textual tradition and oral tradition of Buddhism? What was the Buddha doing for all of those years on Vulture Peak? What use are the sutras? Ryūichi Abe, my teacher's teacher at Harvard University, argues that Buddhism is the world's largest producer of sacred words, and this is very true. There are more pages of sacred text in Buddhism than in any of the rest of the world's religions. That implies that the Buddhists must think there is some use for language. But we should mention that Buddhism is also highly critical of language at times for being insufficient, for being dualistic, and for being fleeting and meaningless. And it argues that only particular types of language are regarded as useful, and we should discuss some of that here.
So yeah, this idea of language being insufficient is something that I've struggled with just as a writer. I frequently struggle to find the right word for a situation, and there have been points where I have concluded that the word I need does not yet exist. So I have some sympathy with Buddhism here.
I agree 100%. There's no word that could ever elicit the same experience that the word is attached to in the listener if that person doesn't already have a memory of it. That's kind of like the example we were using before with chocolate. If someone hasn't tasted it, then when we say chocolate, someone really just gets an incomplete image in their mind of what chocolate is and what it feels like and what it means. And this is even more of a problem for complicated things like enlightenment, or like karma, or any other myriad complicated experiences that humans go through day in and day out.
Or like chocolate. Like, when I say chocolate, do you mean dark chocolate, milk chocolate, white chocolate? Like, the word chocolate alone is not sufficient frequently.
Exactly. And specificity doesn't even really help that much either. Because if we do say dark chocolate, it doesn't imply shape, size, temperature, context in which it's being eaten, preference for whether someone likes it or not. There's all kinds of complicated issues that play into this communication and this coming together of mutual understanding between two communicating parties. And that drives home the importance of the Mahayana doctrine of upaya, or skillful means. Upaya doesn't just apply to language alone, but it does definitely include it. It definitely argues that language should be used delightfully and skillfully to at least paint a broad strokes image of what people who are seeking enlightenment should be seeking for and what it looks like, what the roadmap kind of looks like. But it also comes with the qualifier that the map and the territory are very different and they should not be confused. Meaning, don't get too tied up in the words or the concepts themselves and forget that they are attached to some bigger, more significant, ineffable meaning.
Okay, so let's talk a little more about this. What are some of the doctrines surrounding speech, language, and words?
I would argue that there are two major big picture differences between our common Western understanding of language and the Buddhist understanding of language. The first is that in Buddhism, there's another category of language in addition to written words, speech, grammar, the things we mentioned before. That category is somaticity, meaning related to the body or related to the material concept of sound or of words or of written words. In Buddhism, writing and speaking and communicating are a physical action. It's done with the body, with muscles, and spoken words have a physical body to them. Sound has a shape and a size and an intensity. The essence of that physicality or that somaticity is the same essence as the speaker. That is a nature that is impermanent, empty, marked by suffering caused by desire, and so on. To say all those things acknowledges that words, people, actions, etc. all have a physical impact on the world. We take up space. Words take up space. Especially written words take up space. This leads us into the next important component, which is that spoken and written words and even thought words are karmic. Just like any other action, based on intention and context, they can be karmically good, bad, or neutral. That is an important difference between Western language and Buddhist language. There are certain words that are thought of in a rather simple way to be morally bad to say, no matter the situation. These are called curse words, and it is implied that they're bad because they have bad mojo or they're harmful or destructive in some way. And there's some truth to that. There are some words that have a history or a karmic past, if you will, and that past is marked by a lot of evil and destruction and hurt, and therefore they really should not be used, be they written or spoken or even thought of. There are also words that certain groups of people claim ownership or propriety over due to that word's history. This is not a bad thing in itself, but it argues that a word and the meaning of that word are the same thing. And Buddhism disagrees here in a very significant way. In Buddhism, word and meaning, sign and signifier, are not in a one-to-one relationship. Meaning and sound are both subject to change, exchange, context, intention, and causation. And that's why there's no strong relationship between word and meaning. It's a very salient, transient relationship. To make things even more complex, all words are polysemic, which means that they have multiple meanings, and all those meanings are related to the meanings of all other words. For example, if you look up the word set in an English dictionary, you find as many as 430 definitions for that word, speaking to the fact that sound and meaning are not really closely related. However, because words are marked by the 10 suchnesses and the 3 marks of existence, and all of the other things that everything in reality is marked with, there are sacred words, or soteriologically beneficial words, and there are much less useful words. To chant, recite, copy, read, or talk about the sutras accrues merit and good karma, whereas those who speak ill of them accrue bad karma. That means that we ought to be careful and mindful about how and why and when we use words. That is the doctrine of upaya, or skillful means. We must know the best words for the right times for enlightening others. That would be simple if it was possible to describe enlightenment to a person and have them fully understand it, but Buddhism argues that we can't do that. Therefore, we must use words that are delightful, encouraging, conducive to wisdom, and we should not use words that are wasteful, excessive, or hurtful.
Having listened to all of that, I'm not certain that Buddhism and Western languages actually disagree that much about how language works. For example, one thing you said early on in that was that words have a physical body or something. I don't remember the exact words you used.
A somaticity.
A somaticity. So yeah, what I wanted to point out was that I'm looking at Audacity recording my words right now, and yes, they have a physical shape. My speech is a waveform, and Audacity right now is showing me a physical representation of what that waveform looks like. I think Western philosophy of language also agrees that meaning and word are not particularly set. Words evolve over time. And for a very simple version of that, the word gay used to mean happy. And that's not really how it's used anymore. So, yeah, I'm not sure that there's as much as disagreement about the nature of language as we're talking about here. There are definitely differences. I don't think Western philosophers would agree with the idea of sacred words often, but
I wonder about that point, because while I was talking about sutras, reciting and chanting sutras, I immediately started thinking about prayer in Christianity. And
yeah, that's true too.
On one hand, prayers are asking the Christian God for something, for protection, for healing, for prosperity, for mercy, for whatever. But on the other hand, there are some prayers that are set, like the Lord's Prayer. And I wonder if, because those are soteriologically useful, because those do improve your metaphysical and your afterlife circumstances in some way, I wonder if those are not regarded as sacred words in a similar way to how Buddhism might regard sacred chants or sacred incantations or prayers of some kind.
I think we'd have to talk to a Christian about that, which I don't think we have any on hand, unfortunately. So that's a mystery we'll have to leave for later. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm interested in that answer too. All right, so let's get back to the topic at hand. How do these doctrines play out in ritual and practice?
We have talked extensively about reciting, chanting, reading, and copying the sutras, so we won't go over that again. But I do want to draw your attention to something interesting called dharani. These are short incantations or spells or recitations that are almost always in Sanskrit or Pali. These words are not understood in terms of meaning in the Buddhist context. They are thought of as spells or magical words or incantations, and the sound, pitch, tone, rhythm, and inflection of them are thought to be imbued with beneficial karmic powers. They are understood as being powerful bits of speech that are often recited as part of a sutra or in a ritual setting. For example, no matter what language you are reciting or reading the Heart Sutra in, you will always most likely leave the last line untranslated, and that's because it's a dharani, and it reads gate gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhisvaha. It translates to something like gone, gone, everyone gone to great awakening, or something like that. But the power of those words is not in their meaning at all. It is instead in the way the body moves to make them, the sound they make, and the impact they have on the world around you that is significant. And those dharani are used considerably and in a very popular ritual regarding the Heart Sutra and regarding other sutras. And it's very widespread among a lot of different East Asian Buddhist schools to use these dharani for accruing good karma, purifying bad karma, protecting a space, or blessing a space in some way. And so you'll see that even in countries where the primary spoken language is not Sanskrit or Pali. So it's very important to understand how those work, because a lot of people commonly don't think that Buddhism has spells or magic words but it actually does, in the form of dharani. I would also like to mention mantras. Mantras are similar to dharani in that they are sacred words, which are supposed to facilitate enlightenment or the accrual of merit, but their purpose has some slight differences. They are meant to facilitate a breakdown of the distinction between the speaker and the Buddha. If I recite a mantra, I'm speaking the words of the Buddha, and I become the Buddha when I'm speaking them. Because we're saying the same words in the same way, we're preaching, essentially. So if I'm preaching in the form of a mantra, then I become the Buddha preaching that mantra. Dharani are not necessarily that way. They're more like spells or incantations for protection and healing, while the mantra are meant to make the speaker into the Buddha as they speak the words. Mantra has taken on its own westernized meaning because it's come over with Buddhism and with yoga, and we commonly think of it as like a talismanic phrase that we rely on in times of trouble, or when we need it. So someone's mantra could be everything happens for a reason. And what would be more appropriate actually would probably be to call that a dharani, because that word or that phrase is meant to make a person feel better about something. It's meant to invoke some rule of the universe to improve someone's circumstances, be it emotionally, mentally, or circumstantially at all. So understand that in Buddhism, a mantra is a set phrase that's meant to turn the speaker into a Buddha. The final thing I ought to mention is how the Buddhist conception of language includes non-verbal, non-written communication. The Western conception includes this too in the form of body language. However, Buddhism goes a little bit further. In esoteric Buddhism, for example, the world and all of reality itself is actually thought of as a world text. That is to say that the entire world, all of reality, is thought of as a Buddha preaching the Dharma to himself. So rocks, trees, mountains, the sky, rivers, cell phones, pollution, and everything else are all the letters and the words that the Buddha uses to make sentences which can be read by the enlightened eye as the Dharma itself. In a sense, we are all in a sermon that the Buddha is preaching, and he's preaching it to himself because who else would be there to listen? Because there's nothing else that's not the Buddha. In that system, every object, process, idea, and word has a purpose that is defined by its relationship to other ones. For example, why does poop, or the F word, or genocide exist in the Dharma? It is to teach and demonstrate vulgarity, unwholesomeness, etc. For the same reason, good things exist to teach goodness, wholesomeness, etc.
I like this idea of a world text because in a way it implies that reality is fictional. And as a writer of fiction, I find that extremely appealing.
Absolutely, yeah. And fiction, it holds an interesting place in Buddhism. We've talked before about how dreams are not thought of as being fake because the mind actually goes to those places and those events actually happen because of the non-duality of space and time. And fiction can be thought of in the same way. If you're imagining it, it's equally real as what you're not imagining, as what you're experiencing around you. And so that's a very complex and refined perspective of how fiction functions in the Buddhist context with literature and artwork. Additionally, I should call your attention to a couple of scenes that we've talked about briefly before. The first is in the Vimalakirti Sutra. There's a debate going on between the interlocutors about the nature of non-duality. And there's a famous scene where Vimalakirti pitches in, gives his 2 cents on it, and he's just silent. There's a complete moment of silence, and everybody in the room applauds him because that seems to be the highest understanding of non-duality. There's a lot more to it than that. Yes, words are inherently dualistic, and it's very hard to use them to point at something that's non-dualistic because words define themselves against each other. But silence without context doesn't really push a teaching into someone's mind by itself necessarily. For example, if you asked a teacher what 2 + 2 was and they were silent, that really doesn't tell you that 2 + 2 is 4. So that part of the sutra necessarily sets up a context and leads us to greater and greater and more refined understandings of the relationship between language and non-duality, only to jump over the hump, jump off the cliff edge, if you will, to help us understand that language is so dualistic that in order to get to non-duality, we should shake loose of it. Another important scene, of course, is the birth of Zen Buddhism. The Buddha is preaching similarly about emptiness and non-duality, and he's asking questions of people about it. And the Buddha asks Mahakāssyapa, the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism, or Chan Buddhism, to give his piece, and he just holds up a flower and smiles. And in that, it's understood that the Buddha and Mahakāssyapa had engaged in this mind-to-mind transition of the teaching, this mind-to-mind communication that was non-verbal, non-spoken, non-written, and through that they had reached a superior level of understanding of non-duality, of emptiness, and of awakening. And so, again, this is another situation where just holding up a flower and just smiling in response to that, they don't really sufficiently give us enough information about what the teaching is. They're necessitated by context. And so that really speaks to the Buddhist perspective of language, which is that language is insufficient, but it is useful to get us as far as we can get.
Thank you for joining us in our discussion of Buddhism and language. Join us next week for a discussion of Yogacara Buddhism. What is Yogacara /Fashang/Hoso? How does it differ from other schools in East Asia? What role do other teachings of Buddhism play in Yogacara? See you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or a review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. Tweet us at brightbuddhism. And join us on our Discord server, the Hidden Sangha, link in description. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you very much.